Hey guys, it's Greg with JHDrums bringing you another drum mixing tutorial. Inside today's video, I want to take a look at processing the snare drum. Now we're going to do this in probably a couple videos because there's multiple steps, different inserts that we'll add in our processing stage, and I want to make sure that we focus on them well enough that it doesn't turn into an hour-long video. There's kind of an argument in the recording world that, should I, as far as our insert staging, if we want to compress first, do we want to EQ first? Do we want to, add our dynamic via noise gates first? Things like that. It's my understanding and my general practice that if I add an EQ, I'm getting the sound that I want, and that's from my source. Now, if I add a compressor, I'm going to compress the sound of my source. I want to compress the sound that I ultimately want coming out of the drum so that I don't have the compressor working on all this low mud that I'll later EQ out. In that case, having the compressor before the EQ. So at least to me, it makes sense to add an EQ first. So that's what we're going to do today, is add an EQ to the snare. And we want to do this via our bus. If you're working with just a single top mic, you don't have to worry about the bus. You'll just be adding your inserts via, your insert channel on your snare top mic. But in this case, I do have a snare top and a snare bottom, which is being routed to a bus. So that is where I want to include my inserts. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and add our EQ insert. In Logic, of course, we're going to go to our insert channel and we're going to go to EQ, channel EQ, and this is a mono EQ that we'll add. Although it is a bus track, both of our inputs that are being bused to this track are mono, so it's going to be a mono source. So what we can do, first thing I like to look at again is a high pass filter with the snare, and we do this the same way that we did with the overheads. We're going to engage the high pass, we're going to walk it up in the frequency range, and we're going to check to see when there's an audible difference, when I'm basically cutting off too much of the lows and I need to bring it back. So we need to find the sweet spot. Now, with this particular practice, I do like to solo, so I am going to solo the snare bus to do this. But we'll go ahead and engage our high-pass filter. We'll set our curve to be at 18 dB per octave. Again, just meaning that it's going to subtract 18 dB for every octave that it passes through. And we will go ahead and scrub up our frequency selection and see the change that we can monitor here and find the sweet spot. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, if I bring it up, see, past the 200 hertz range generally is going to be too much on your snare. That's where a lot of the body lies in the snare. Again, check the 100 hertz range. I mean, to me, I'm not losing anything. There's nothing necessary there in that frequency range within the snare that I'm losing by creating this high pass filter. So we can go higher than 100 hertz. And notice I'm a little high on the 140s. All right, so about 130. Now, some of you may be thinking, whoa, that's way too much. Some of you may be thinking, why are you leaving that much low end in the snare? Generally, I want to be able to control this low end, but I still want to be able to adjust the body of the snare and make sure that it's intact. So that's why I like to keep it around this range. The next thing I'll take a look at is the body of the snare, and that generally lies in the 200 hertz range. Now, the way I'll monitor this is just, play it, and starting with the 200 hertz frequency selection, I'll use a Q of 1. We'll go ahead and play, and I will increase this by, 3 or 4 dB, see where we're sitting, and then we can move it around. But generally, right around 200 hertz is going to be representative of the body or the beef of our snare. So let's take a listen. Let's widen that Q out. See, I can bring this up 6 dB if I want, or more. So that's with, without. Now, to me, that's way too much. I think we're in a good place at the 200 hertz range. So let's follow that 3 dB rule, and then let's move it up a little bit and see if we get any better response from the low end. I'm still finding right around the 200 range is going to be the best representation of the body of the snare. It's a brass snare, and it's a 6.5-inch depth, so it's got some punch to it, but the overall fullness of it is going to be more pingy due to its the material that it's made out of. If you have a wooden snare, maple, birch, etc., you may find that this frequency range needs to be tamed a little bit more, or you may find that you need to boost it more. It's really dependent upon your source, of course, the mics you use, the room you're in, etc. So play around with that frequency range, generally around 200 hertz. If you find that your snare is lacking body, give it a boost. Keep your Q relatively wide when you are boosting, and keep it subtle. That's the big thing. So try, nowhere above 3 to 4 if you can. If it's necessary, and it sounds good to you, go ahead and boost it more. There's no set rule, but the more subtle that we can keep it, the better. So let's move on to, there's something going on with this snare. Now, I'll go ahead and turn off the 200 hertz because we just went over that, but there's something going on in the 600 hertz range that I'm hearing, and that's just from experience, but I can notice a ping almost if we listen. And so what I'm going to do is create I'm going to sweep the EQ there. Now, I did this in the previous video, but I didn't necessarily go over how I go about doing a Q sweep, or an EQ sweep. I bring my Q all the way up so it's as narrow as possible, and then I'll boost as high, as much gain as I can get out of my EQ. Now, this is going to differ between DAWs, but just, that way we can focus on one, basically this is one frequency. And then by sweeping, I move, up and down in the frequency range. So let's start around the 600 hertz. And when you're sweeping, you want to listen to the transient overtones within that frequency. And what that turns out to be audibly is a ringing in that particular, the selected frequency that you have with your sweep. So let's monitor that, and let's listen for that ring or that bell sound. And once we find it, we can get rid of it by cutting. So check this out. Hear that ring? Yeah. Right there. So at 660 hertz, I think, that's what I'm hearing when I'm listening to the snare. Now, it is a brass snare, and that's a character of this snare. It's going to have that kind of pingy sound. But since it is bugging me a little bit, I'm going to cut it. And since I found it, I've got my Q all the way up to just a single frequency. I'm just going to go ahead and just completely get rid of that. Now, you can do this, or if you find that it's, ranging in, more than just that selected frequency, you can go ahead and broaden your EQ by bringing the Q back down. But typically, if we're sweeping and we're trying to get rid of just one offending frequency, this is what I'll do. So let's monitor that. I'll turn it off and then I'll turn it on and we'll see the difference. So again, this is off and then on. You hear that pop back up? Whoa, 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 whoa. That's the forgive me for my interpretation of the sound and trying to recreate it, but that's what I'm trying to get rid of. So if you pay close attention when you're monitoring what your source is actually captured, find the frequencies that kind of bother you or bug you and cut them, get them out of there. Subtractive EQ, it'll save you all the time in the world and it'll make your mixes cleaner. So I absolutely recommend doing that. The other things that I may focus on, and again, this is not necessarily something I do in solo mode, so it's going to kind of be, just winging it here, listening to it, just the snare top and bottom. But there's really the frequency ranges between 2K and up into the 7K range. 2K is going to be more of the snap or the attack of the actual head of the snare. In the 5,000 range, we're going to get more of the head sound, so more of that pingy sound, which I think this particular drum capture is fine. We may not need to adjust that. And then upwards in the 7K range, you're going to find more of the snare wire. If you do have your snare captured with only a single microphone, meaning that you only mic the top of the snare, not the bottom, you may find that boosting in the 7K range will bring out the snare wire that you weren't able to capture because you either didn't have the microphones or you didn't have the inputs. So let's take a look at each of those frequency ranges and see if we can't dial this in a little bit better. So let's start around the 2K range on our next frequency band. Bring our Q up to about 1. You hear that? It's just the snap of the head, the crack of the head is going to lie in that 2,000 hertz range. Now, I think we're okay. I don't, for this particular take, I don't think I need too much of that. I think once the compression's added, I mean, we're going to be fine in that area. But, I may want to leave a little bit of a boost with a relatively wide Q. Bring it down to about 0.79. And we'll boost about 1.5. So this is with it. And even that may not be necessary. I'm not really liking that particular frequency range in this snare, but it all depends on what was captured with your mic. That's fine. Just a single dB is going to be good for me. Just bringing out a little bit more of the attack on that. So, next thing to look at will probably be around the 5K range. And that is going to be more representative of the actual head itself, the texture, if you will, of the snare drum. So let's start with a Q of 1. And we'll go ahead and monitor, and we'll boost around that 5K range and move around and see what difference those selected frequencies make. So if I boost a lot, see how it kind of brings out the it's almost like I put a different head on the drum when I add that much of an EQ boost to it, but it just kind of brightens things up. And typically, I'll keep this Q narrower. Let's go ahead and bring up the Q of that one too. But I like making it, adding a little bit of texture. So around 2 or 3 dB in that 5K range is going to be just fine. Check this out. What we'll do, actually, I'm going to keep that. Well, like I mentioned before, the 2K range is going to be, the attack. The 5K range is going to be more of the texture, and the 7K range is going to be the wires. So let's bring this 5K range up into the 7K range, and we'll be able to monitor what it does to our sound and see how it can bring out the wires in our snare. It's right at 7K. Again, I'll go ahead and bypass it, and then we'll listen to it with it engaged. So without and with. And you may want to narrow your cue a little bit, because we are focusing on a certain. Those wires are going to lie in a real particular frequency. And that's just if if you have a single mic. Of course, if we go back and look, I mean, if you've got a snare top and snare bottom, you're going to be able to completely control how much wire you have via this one fader. So that may not necessarily be something you need to do if you have top and bottom. But if you do have just a single mic on top, that 7K frequency range is going to be your friend. So let's go back to our EQ. We'll bring this back down to the 5K range. Yeah, definitely digging that. And the 2 just to bring out more of the attack of the snare. Now, notice, I mean, I'm not really adjusting the frequencies that much. It's real subtle, and it's stretched across the entire frequency range. So keep that in mind next time you're going and you see somebody, just for an example, if you see somebody add an EQ like this. Now let's say they went ahead and they've added the high pass, and they're like, okay, I want to get rid of that, but in my 200 hertz range, I'm going to boost, 8 dB and widen it. I don't want the mud, so I'm going to cut that out. Of course, I want my attack, so in the 2K range, and I'm going to really boost that. I mean, I love that attack. And you see what I'm saying? When you get into this extreme, now there's nothing necessarily wrong with this. If it sounds good, that's fine. But at least it's my thinking that if we can get the sound that we want by just subtly adjusting the EQ, little tweaks here and there, it's going to go such a long way towards the headroom that we can achieve with our final bounce. It's going to go a long way towards, the processing load on our computer, the processing load on the consecutive plugins that we're adding, etc. So it's just going to overall be a better practice to keep things subtle, keep them simple, and not overdo it. Plus, I mean, headroom is one of the most important things you can have in a dynamic drum or a dynamic mix, which drums are. So, okay, that's enough of me rambling. Let's take a listen to the snare with the EQ bypassed, and then we will add the EQ back in, and we'll go ahead and just solo it with the overhead bus. So let's take a listen to that. So bypass, and then we'll engage it. Bypass, engaged. Let's get bypassed again. And engage. Now, we can do this too, just soloing. I don't like to do that, but just so you can tell the difference. This is the before and the after. You hear that frequency come back in that we got rid of? So overall within our EQ, we've kept it subtle. We've tightened it up by adding the high pass, getting rid of the frequencies that we don't need. We've added a little bit of presence, a little bit of attack, and that's really all we need to do. And that's going to be it for this video. The next video, we will take a look at compression and evening out our dynamics and the way we can get our snare to sit the way we want in our mix. So be sure to stay tuned for the next snare processing video, and implement subtle EQ changes. Don't make it too drastic if it doesn't need to be, guys. Do this, make better drum mixes. Again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'm happy to get back to you guys. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.